There are few teams in NFL history that have even come close to a perfect season. In fact, in NFL history, there are only 4 teams that have ever gone undefeated in the regular season. Of every incredible team and dynasty, there is only one team that managed to have the definition of a perfect season. The 1972 Miami Dolphins stand as one of the most iconic teams of all time that managed to hang on to a 17-0 record. Today, I wanted to go over this team's perfect season and explain just what it was about them that made them so special. The Dolphins had only been founded in 1966 under, at the time, head coach George Wilson. Wilson managed to get the Dolphins just 15 wins in his first 4 years before he was fired and replaced with the legendary Don Shula. Shula made 2 moves after being hired that would come to be crucial for their legendary run. He hired Howard Schnellenberg as offensive coordinator and Bill Arnsparger as defensive coordinators. In Shula's first season, he managed to drastically improve the Dolphins to a 10-4 record, which secured them a playoff berth. He also managed to take the Dolphins to the Super Bowl in just his second season, where they fell short against the Dallas Cowboys. The team was primarily focused around star players like quarterback Bob Griese, who in 1971 had been responsible for nearly 2,100 yards through the air, which was great for a QB at the time. They also had Mercury Morris, who was an incredible downhill running back that at times seemed almost impossible to tackle. At receiver, they had Paul Warfield, Howard Twilley, Otto Stowe, Ed Jenkins, and Marlon Briscoe, while Larry Csonka rounded out their running game, with fullbacks being used much more often at the time. They also had a solid offensive line that allowed the offense to actually execute a playbook, and this combined with an elite defense featuring Doug Swift, Vern Den Herder, Tim Foley, Curtis Johnson, Jake Scott, and Dick Anderson. Coming into the 1972 season, the Dolphins were thought to be expecting a down year. Coming off a Super Bowl loss, it isn't unusual for teams to have a slight downtrend in production. Fans got even more nervous when their preseason got off to a horrible start. We all know preseason games don't actually count and are a bad judge of a team's true performance. But when the Dolphins went 3-3 through the preseason, some thought they could potentially miss the playoffs. Coming into week 1, they were facing the Chiefs at their home stadium, and the Chiefs had been a dominant team during recent memory. It was not going to be a cakewalk week 1, and the Dolphins had their work cut out for them. They got off to an early start with a first quarter touchdown, followed by another and a field goal in the second quarter. By the third quarter, the score had reached 20-3 for the Dolphins, and while the Chiefs would score another touchdown during regulation, the Dolphins remained in control for the entirety of the game. Len Dawson and the Chiefs had to hang their heads and return to the locker room defeated, while the Dolphins showcased their dangerous dual back system that would prove to be a problem all season. One thing that has changed in the modern game is that the fullback is often not utilized, but the Dolphins combined Larry Csonka and Mercury Morris to give them one of the best backfield duos of all time. In week 2, they had their first home game against the Houston Oilers. It was their first game on their new artificial turf, and while it has come a long way at the time, it was incredibly slippery when wet. Obviously, Miami is a place that gets rain pretty frequently, and this day was no exception. The bad field conditions led to a fumble early in the game for the Oilers that Miami returned all the way to their 1-yard line. Miami capitalized on this with a field goal, and the next drive had another Oilers turnover that Mercury Morris capitalized on for a touchdown. One of Miami's secret weapons was their kicker, Garo Yepremian, and he had made 75 straight extra points up to this point. The bad field conditions led to a blocked kick, but this lit a fire in Garo that would lead to an incredible season. Miami quickly scored yet again, and by halftime, the score was 20-0 in favor of the Dolphins. Miami scored again in the third quarter, and another score in the fourth put them in a commanding lead. A fourth quarter interception by Tim Foley locked up the game, and they won with a final score of 34-13. The next week would prove to be one of their most challenging games of the season, and they had to take a trip up to Minneapolis to face the Vikings on their home turf. This was a Vikings team with Fran Tarkenton, and they were definitely not going to be a pushover like the Oilers had just been. The Vikings came out and scored first, with Fran connecting with John Gilliam in the end zone to give them an early lead. The game remained scoreless going into halftime, but an early Tim Foley interception put the Dolphins in position to kick a field goal. They followed this up with another in the third, and the Vikings had their lead cut to just 1 point. The Vikings, however, scored yet again, and it wasn't until the end of the fourth where the Dolphins had a last-minute touchdown that put them in the lead. The final score was 16-14, and it really was the Dolphins' defense that kept them in this game. They had sacked Tarkenton 5 times and intercepted him 3 times as well. The next 2 weeks were pretty uneventful blowouts against the Jets and Chargers. They won the game against the Jets with a final score of 27-17, and the Chargers were beaten with a final score of 24-10. The Chargers game came with a serious injury to a Dolphins star, however, when starting quarterback Bob Griese ended up breaking his ankle after being sacked by Deacon Jones. This took him out for the entirety of the season and wouldn't come back until the AFC Championship game. This put the Dolphins in the hands of 38-year-old Earl Morall, who had previously accepted his role as a primarily backup quarterback for the team. That is something that makes the 1972 Dolphins even more impressive, the fact that they went undefeated despite using their backup quarterback for most of the season. Their Week 6 matchup against the Buffalo Bills would prove to be another nail-biter. They started hot off the backs of their running game. Mercury Morris punched a touchdown in early to give them a small lead, but the Bills replied in the second quarter with 13 points of their own. A few preventable turnovers by the Dolphins let the Bills hold a 13-7 lead going into halftime. The Dolphins, however, came out swinging the third with 10 points of their own, but the Bills replied with their own 10 points in the fourth. A final touchdown by Mercury Morris was the difference maker to give the Dolphins a 24-23 victory as time expired. Somehow, despite a backup quarterback and preventable turnovers, they had managed to extend their record to 6-0. Week 7 saw them playing the Colts, but honestly, this game was the definition of a blowout. They ended up destroying the Colts 23-0 with Larry Csonka and Mercury Morris absolutely blowing out the Colts defense on the ground. The Dolphins even had a blocked field goal by Lloyd Mumford to prevent the Colts from getting on the board at all. Week 8 was another match against the Bills, and this time the Dolphins held a commanding control over the game with a final score of 30-16. At this point, the entire league was looking toward the Dolphins as they extended to 8 straight wins. Despite the injuries to their starters, their running game and incredible defense made the season anything but a waste. Week 9 was probably one of their funniest games of the year. They faced the New England Patriots and put on a masterclass where they absolutely destroyed them with a final score of 52-0. It actually is to this day the most lopsided win in the history of the Dolphins versus Patriots rivalry. The next week they played the Jets yet again, and while it was closer than before, they still managed to win with a final score of 28-24. In Week 11, they put an absolute beating on the St. Louis Cardinals and walked away with a 31-10 final score. Week 12 featured another absolute beating of the Patriots with a score of 37-21, and at this point there started to be a lot of hype toward the Dolphins achieving a perfect season. It had been decades since another team had been able to complete a perfect regular season, and even divisional rival fans started to be impressed by this incredible run. Week 13 saw the Dolphins traveling to Yankee Stadium to take on the New York Giants. At first, the Giants came out and scored on their first drive. The New York crowd was elated, but quickly the Dolphins took control back. The Dolphins had cornerback Curtis Johnson, who proved to be a huge thorn in the side of the Giants this game. He had an interception alongside breaking up a few potential huge plays. At the end of the game, the Dolphins hung on to a 23-13 lead, and at that point found themselves just 1 week away from the perfect season. They had to face the Baltimore Colts yet again to secure their perfect season, but considering their first matchup was a total blowout, the team wasn't that nervous coming into the matchup. They scored first with a 40-yard field goal from Garrow, and then scored a touchdown in the second from an Earl Morall throw to Paul Warfield. They had 2 more field goals, and by that point, they had a 16-0 lead. The Colts starting quarterback went down with a sprained ankle, and when they placed in an ancient Johnny Unitas, the Dolphins knew their perfect record was secured. As time expired, the Dolphins began to celebrate, realizing they had completed the perfect season. It was the first time since the 1948 Cleveland Browns that a team had completed a perfect regular season. At this point, going into the playoffs, the Dolphins were huge favorites to go all the way. They had absolutely dominated most of the teams they had played this year. Even their highest level competition showed the Dolphins' ability to finish close games and play in the clutch. Their first playoff game was going to be the divisional matchup against the Cleveland Browns. They had completed a 10-4 season off the back of Mike Phipps at quarterback and future Hall of Famer Leroy Kelly at running back. Their defense was also formidable with legends like Billy Andrews, Ben Davis, and Walter Johnson. While any team would have been at a disadvantage against the Dolphins, this was not the regular season where they would be slam dunking on the Baltimore Colts anymore. Playoff football is a different beast, and they had to bring their A game to continue their record. The The game got off to a good start in the game when Charlie Babb blocked a punt and returned it for a touchdown to give the Dolphins an early lead. They also had a Garo Yepremian field goal shortly after to take a 10-0 lead. They kept that lead into halftime, but in the third quarter, the Browns scored a touchdown and another in the fourth to give them a 14-13 lead. In the final minutes of the game, the Dolphins went on a legendary drive. They went 80 yards and scored off the back of a Jim Kick 8-yard run. The Dolphins had managed to intercept the Browns 5 times in the affair, and those mistakes ultimately cost them the game as the Dolphins won with a final score of 20-14. Now, the Dolphins had to go face the Pittsburgh Steelers in the AFC Championship game. The Steelers had actually just had their immaculate reception game against the Raiders to reach the championship. They came into an early 7-0 lead off the back of a Terry Bradshaw fumble that his own guard recovered in the end zone to score. Miami replied with a fake punt on 4th down that ended in a 37-yard rush and then a 9-yard touchdown pass. After this touchdown, Bob Griese was put back in the game for the first time since he had broken his ankle earlier in the season. He was now in charge of the Miami offense. On his first drive back in the game, he had a 52-yard pass that the Dolphins used to capitalize for another touchdown. Miami scored again, and their lead increased to 21-10. The Steelers did manage to score another touchdown in the fourth quarter, but it was not enough to take back the lead, and the Dolphins won with a final score of 21-17. This extended their record to 16-0 and secured them an appearance in the Super Bowl. With Bob Griese back, the fans had an idea that they would be able to win the championship and complete the definition of a perfect year. They were going to be facing the Washington football team in Super Bowl VII. This team was definitely going to be their best competition of the year. They had backup quarterback Billy Kilmer after Sonny Jurgensen had gone down in the preseason with injury, Larry Brown at running back, Bill Brindage at defensive tackle, Hall of Famer Chris Hanberger at linebacker, and Mike Bass at corner. Their offensive and defense were both elite. While Miami had managed to rack up tons of points on lower-level competition, it was not as likely they would be able to blow out such an elite defense. The game was played at the iconic Los Angeles Coliseum, and shockingly, betting odds actually favored the Washington team by 1 point. Once the game started, it became abundantly clear that this was going to be a mighty defensive battle. In the final minutes of the first quarter, Miami did manage to score on a touchdown pass from Bob Griese to Howard Twilley. On the next drive, Jake Scott intercepted Kilmer, and the wind was taken out of Washington's sails. Miami scored on a last-second touchdown before halftime and held a 14-0 lead early. The last score of the game came when Garo Yepremian attempted to kick a 42-yard field goal. This kick was blocked by Bill Brundage, and Garo scooped up the blocked kick to attempt to throw it downfield. The only issue for Garo is that he had the arm of a kicker and ended up throwing it into the arms of Mike Bass, who played corner for Washington. Mike ended up running it all the way back to the end zone to score, but it didn't matter because as time expired, the Dolphins held onto their 1-touchdown lead. Don Shula had secured his position as one of the greatest coaches of all time and would go on to lead the Dolphins through their golden era. The Dolphins extended their record to 17-0 and completed the perfect season. The MVP award was given to Jake Scott, who had done a great job in the secondary and wound up with 2 interceptions during the Super Bowl. They had managed to make the Washington offense look like a pee-wee football team. When it came to the other year's awards, the Dolphins actually did not have the league MVP on their roster. Larry Brown, who played running back for Washington, had actually earned that honor. Don Shula did win Coach of the Year, but obviously going undefeated will wrap that up in the bag. Earl Morall, the quarterback in his late 30s who had stepped up to lead the team to an undefeated record when Bob Griese went down, was awarded the Comeback Player of the Year award. Players Bob Griese, Larry Csonka, Paul Warfield, Larry Little, Jake Scott, Mercury Morris, and Bill Stanfill all made the Pro Bowl team as well. In the years that have passed since the Dolphins completed their perfect year, 8 of the players have been added to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Their Director of Player Personnel, Bobby Biethard, is in the hall, alongside linebacker Nick Buonaconti, running back Larry Csonka, QB Bob Griese, center Jim Langer, guard Larry Little, receiver Paul Warfield, and their coach Don Shula. The team has definitely become one of the most iconic rosters of all time. I know that some people claim that they had a weak schedule and took advantage of the different schedule setting at the time. However, the scheduling worked on a rotation per year basis, so it's not the Dolphins' fault if their games weren't against the hardest competition. I also think it's telling that they were so dominant through the year that even with their backup quarterback, they managed to go undefeated. Maybe their scheduling being easy would be more of a point if they had their starting QB, but there is no way, even with an easy schedule, that you are supposed to go undefeated in the NFL. Apparently, there is also an urban legend that every time the last undefeated team loses in the modern era, the remaining members of the 1972 Dolphins get together to celebrate with a glass of champagne, cheering the fact no one has been able to replicate the run they've been on in the 50 years since. We all know the Patriots came close to a perfect season, but if you don't close it out in the biggest game of the year, then it doesn't count. One thing that does suck for the fans is that most of the games were actually not on television in the local market. For some reason, the NFL had an agreement in place in 1972 that blacked out all teams' home games in their local market. So if you were a Dolphins fan in Miami during their undefeated run, you either had to go out of your market to watch them or pay for a ticket. You would have to drive to Jacksonville in order to have gotten a Dolphins game while living in Florida. I am glad they changed this now, but I do think the pomp and circumstances around their perfect season would have been a lot higher if the local market had actually been able to watch them do it. One other funny story about this entire debacle is when Richard Nixon gets involved. Richard Nixon was a huge Washington fan and was so upset by the fact they had been defeated in the Super Bowl that he did not extend an invitation to the Dolphins to visit the White House. Playing football so well that the at the time sitting president can't look at you because you beat his team so badly is quite the compliment. They were invited to the White House in 2013 to actually complete what should have been their traditional visit. I do think that this team will always have a legendary status amongst football fans. With the new extended schedule and the competition being closer than ever, I feel like it is more difficult than it's ever been to actually have an undefeated season. A 14-game regular season is a lot more conducive to going undefeated. It doesn't mean it was easy for the Dolphins to do. It just is mathematically a lot harder to go undefeated over 18 weeks. I think if anything, this is a benefit to the Dolphins players, because there is a good chance they remain the only undefeated team in history for some time. I have a lot of respect for any team that can show this level of dominance over their peers, and I had a lot of fun researching this video and understanding what the league used to be like. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to press the like button and be sure to subscribe if you enjoy football videos like this. We are trying to hit 10K subscribers this year and would love your support.